Okay, we're going to do one on Deuteronomy, mainly 28. Deuteronomy 28 has a prophecy in it, and it says that the true Israelites are going to be put back in slave ships, go to Egypt. And we found here where it's fulfilled in Judah, and this explains it quite well. The Israelites were warned that if they did not keep the Torah, they would be punished in Deuteronomy 28:58, with a host of calamities. These calamities include an attack by an enemy from a distant country who is compared to an eagle. 28:49 says, "The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand." And of course, they didn't understand Roman language. It's a different dialect, but the Romans used eagles as their symbol, as the sacred emblem of their legions, and a lot of them had it on their shields, or on breastplates, on their standards. After the 10 tribes were exiled, it was as if they were temporarily suspended from membership in spiritual Israel, and for the time being not obligated by the law. And it says this in Jeremiah 3:8 and Hosea 1:9, and also in Isaiah 11:13. Judah, however, remained under the obligation to keep all the commandments and to obey the sages. So if Judah would not so act, then they were to be liable for punishments that included being taken captive, transported in ships, and sold as slaves into Egypt, into bondage, and so on, as they say. Now, Deuteronomy 28:68 says, "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again." So this had already happened once before. They had already been into Egypt, and I guess this is relating back to whenever they had first left. This is something which I believe in another chapter he tells you that this is something I said would never happen again. But into there again with ships. "By the way thereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondsmen, and shall buy you." No, this is it. This is the other version of it where it says the same thing. Thou shalt see it no more again, but yet there you are. Now it also goes on to say, "And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen, and shall buy you." Right? And then it tells you the Aramaic translation, also known as Targum Yonatan ben Uziel, paraphrases the above verse as saying, "And Hashem," which means the name, "will exile you back to Egypt in ships by way of the Reed Sea." I want to make note of that right there, that it never actually in the old translation, it never said Reed Sea, it said Sea of Reeds. And therefore the Sea of Reeds is actually the giant papyrus field that used to flood out at the end of the delta there. And it shows you that the Hyksos expulsion is the only thing that really can correlate to this in exact time. But anyhow, it says, "The Reed Sea that you once crossed, and concerning which I said, thou shalt not see it again, and there you will be sold into servitude to your enemies for large sums of money as craftsmen, and afterwards you will be sold cheaply as slaves and maidservants, until you will be cheapened, and try to sell yourselves for nothing, and no one will take you in." Deuteronomy 28:68. So this is relating to the fact that there'll be so many of them, and no one will really want them because of everything that happened and who they are, and so they'll become cheap. And there's stories about that. Now it says this punishment happened to the Jews at least twice. We want to look at these. So one is at the fall of the Second Temple, which is at the Jewish Revolt, which was 66 to 70 AD, and indeed it actually had a whiplash and an ending out at Har Megiddo in 73 AD, which would have been the prophecy of Jesus, 40 years exactly to the date. He was 33 at Passover, and at Passover they killed this off, and it relates to Titus. And now Titus had come down and done the campaign, and he was the one that rode in on a white horse. But that's a whole nother story with Josephus and everything going along with it, but we're going to look at that. And again, the second one would have been the rebellion of Bar Kokhba. Now, after the fall of the Second Temple, 70 CE, Joseph reports that Because the soldiers were now growing weary of bloodshed and survivors appeared constantly, Caesar orders to kill only those who offered armed resistance and to take alive all the rest. And the troops, in addition to those covered by their orders, slaughtered the aged and the infirmed. So old people, they couldn't get to even walk, they just went ahead and waylaid them. People to their prime who might be useful, they herded into the temple area and shut up the court of the women. That's in Ecclesiastes 4:16. Caesar appointed one of his freedmen as their guard, his friend Fronto, to decide the fate appropriate to each. And that's 4:17. All those who had taken part in sedition and brigandage, or the bad guys, they informed against each other. So apparently they informed against each other. They were like, who did it and who did it and who did it, and then they all executed all of them, even the snitches. He picked out the tallest and handsomest of the lot and reserved for them the triumph. And so whenever he rode in, when Titus rode in, he had a triumph. And there's the giant arch that's there, and it shows you them bringing in even the the menorah and all the stuff from there and these people. And so he had brought them into there. Of the rest, those who were over 17, he put in chains and sent to hard labor in Egypt, while great numbers were presented to Titus to the provinces to perish in the theaters by sword or by wild beasts. So this would have been having to go to the gladiator fights and things like that. Those under 17 were sold, and that was written by Josephus in his The Jewish Wars. That's book 6, 9-2. And another thing about this is whenever this all went down in the Jewish Wars, he records it as being the abomination of desolation. And that's another thing that really key points it. But there's another account that happened shortly after, and definitely before the Council of Nicaea, and could be pulled into the idea here whenever they write this in, because it says, after the fall of Betar, which is around 135 CE, Cassius, who lived from 150 to 235, a Roman historian, tells us that few Jews remained alive. 50 of their strongest fortified cities and 985 of the best towns and villages were demolished, as they kept up with these small little villages they ran into, down rivers, down so on. 580,000 died on the battlefield. Besides countless others who perished of hunger and pestilence, the entire land of Judah was almost transformed into a barren wasteland. Now, Munter, which is a Roman historian, also counted that now that Betar had been captured, everything came under human control. While Palestine, Judah, was reduced to a desolate mound, and indeed they tell you in the story of Josephus that that's whenever the temple got shown down and there was not one stone left standing. So that had happened, and Titus came riding in on a white horse, exactly like it said. And the 4 horsemen were the 4-horse chariots that these Romans had. But and the 7-headed dragon and all that is the 7 heads of Rome and everything. My brother's a deacon in church, and he knows that. He says that 90% of it comes straight from that. So first they were brought to the grand annual market at the Tabernath Aloe tree, which is a famous tree. I've got it in a video and everything, but this is the supposed Aloe tree in Hebron, or in the words of Hieronymus, the tent Ohel of Abraham near Hebron. Now, this is supposedly the tree that Abraham planted there, and that would have been a Sumerian thing to plant a tree. It also goes with a Christmas thing and everything else, and we are right near there in the holidays, but I'm not going to go there. Each slave sold for the price of a horse. These captives who were not sold there were brought to the marketplace in Azah, which is Gaza, which, because of the great multitudes of slaves who were sold there, was called Hadrian's Marketplace. And those who were still not sold there were herded into ships and were taken into Egypt. Many died in transit, whether by starvation or by shipwrecks, which didn't Paul endure like 5 shipwrecks? But anyhow, while many also were killed by cruel masters. And this was accounted by Munter in Primordia Ecclesiastes African, page 85. The toll of the Bar Kokhba uprising was devastating both on the population and on the places of habitation. The numbers of dead were awesome, while multitudes of Jews were taken captive to fill the slave markets near and far. The slave market of the Tabernacle of Hebron was particularly famous as a center where Jewish slaves, sent into captivity by Hadrian, were sold. So many Jewish slaves were available that, according to one report, a Jew was sold for as little as the price of a portion of horse feed. Now, this is the history of Am Yisrael in ancient days. Innumerable was the multitude of those who were sold away as slaves. At the annual market at Tabernacle of Hebron, they were offered for sale in such numbers that Jewish slave was no more value than a horse. What could not be disposed of there was brought to Gaza, and they'd be sold into Egypt, on the way which many died of hunger or of a shipwreck. So apparently more than one people knew there was a few shipwrecks, or maybe whenever they tried to transit 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 ships, who knows, there was a big storm, and most of those boats, if not all, went down. Something, we can't find that moment yet, but apparently everybody recants this shipwreck that would gone down, and how it had taken a lot out during that time. So this, again, is what actually happened. Now, people say, well, that hasn't happened yet, and whenever that happens, or so on, or African Americans always say, that's us because we were slaves. And it's like, man, there were slaves all over the place before people even found you. It's been going back for a long time, and black people enslaving each other and stuff. That's how the slave market started down there. It's not, it didn't just, you're not in this book. It's not about you. It's not your book. It's this prophecy that they had here that was going to happen. And what's odd about it is most historians now realize that it was written pretty much after the fact, almost like if I was to write a book now and tell you that it was BC, but it was about Abraham Lincoln and Kennedy and da-da-da and da-da, and you'd think, oh man, you're some great prophet, but it was actually just written just shortly after these periods. And that's the reason it was fresh on their mind and what would happen to people. And then, of course, a couple of 100 years later, they were like, yeah, something like that did happen. And so you could tell that it would just blend into it, and everybody would kind of go with it. They knew kind of the history, because people didn't share history too much back then, but it would blend, it would work, and that's all they were trying to do with this. Anyhow, there's Deuteronomy for y'all. Lots more coming up. Peace.